Dakota Territory, winter of 1892. The first time Elias Rowan climbed the hill to the abandoned water tower, frost had already begun stitching silver lines across the prairie grass. The town below moved with that late autumn urgency settlers knew too well, men chopping wood in doubled rhythm, women stretching canvas across window seams, children dragging kindling in armfuls too large for their arms. Smoke rose low and sideways from cabin chimneys, pressed flat by a steady northern wind that had begun testing every wall for weakness. The tower stood apart from all of it. It had been built in 1878 when the rail spur still mattered, when steam engines paused long enough to drink from its iron tank. 30 feet of timber framing lifted a rust-streaked cylinder above the ground. The wood had faded from brown to a dull gray, bleached by 14 summers and scoured by 14 winters. The ladder fixed to its side had missing rungs. The access door at the base hung slightly crooked, swollen by years of damp and neglect. Most people saw decay. Elias saw a pattern. He stood there longer than necessary, hands in his coat pockets, watching how the wind moved around it. The prairie wind did not strike the tower the way it struck the cabins below. It did not slam and splinter and search for corners. It curled. It wrapped. It slipped past with a sound more like breath than a blow. He had spent enough winters in drafty shacks to know what corners meant. Behind him, wagon wheels creaked on frozen soil. A pair of boys slowed their team to stare at him. "You thinking of tearing it down for lumber?" One called. Elias did. T answer. He was counting the seconds between gusts. The truth was, he owned nothing but a mule, a stove, 2 crates of tools, and a grief he did not speak about. The small cabin he rented the previous year had never truly been warm. His wife had coughed through December and January while frost crawled along the inside wall above their bed. By February, she had grown quiet in a way that frightened him. By March, the prairie wind no longer mattered to her. When he left that cabin, he left most of himself behind. He had studied the way snow drifted against the flat plank walls. He had noticed how wind pressed hardest into the seams at corners. He had felt the floorboards numb his feet because they sat flush on frozen ground. The tower was different. Its base stood elevated on thick timber supports. Air moved beneath it. No soil pressed upward with damp and frost. The walls formed a circle, no edges to catch the full force of the wind. The height meant snow did not bury its entrance. The structure had survived 14 winters without anyone tending it. That was proof enough. He bought it for the price of scrap wood and a promise to clear brush around the hill. The town clerk laughed as he signed the paper. Planning to water trains that don't come anymore. Elias folded the document carefully and tucked it inside his coat. Planning to stay warm, he said. The laughter followed him out the door. He began work the next morning. The first task was the door. It scraped across the threshold and refused to close tight. He removed it, shaved the swollen edges with slow, patient strokes of his plane, and reset the hinges deeper into the frame. Then he sealed the edges with strips of canvas soaked in linseed oil. When he shut it again, it met the frame without a gap. He stood inside afterward, letting the wind blow as hard as it wished outside. The sound changed immediately. Instead of a whistle slicing through cracks, it became a low, circling hum. Dust lay thick across the interior floor. Old iron bolts and broken ladder pieces littered the base. Above him, cross braces formed an intricate web of beams holding the tank overhead. When he looked up, he could see faint slivers of daylight where boards had shrunk apart. He climbed. The ladder creaked but held. At the top platform, he inspected the iron tank. Rust flaked beneath his gloves. The interior smelled of stale water and metal. He did not intend to sleep up there, but he studied it anyway, imagining how cold air would settle and how heat would rise. Heat rises. He repeated the thought like a prayer. Over the next week, townsfolk passed the hill and slowed to watch him haul materials inside. He carried sacks of sawdust purchased cheaply from the mill. He cut straw from leftover bales and stuffed them into burlap. He dragged in planks scavenged from an abandoned shed near the rail line. Children gathered at the base some afternoons, daring one another to knock on the tower door. When Elias opened it, they scattered in shrieks, convinced the lonely widower had gone mad. Building a nest in a water tank. Someone shouted from below one evening. He did not argue. He worked methodically. First, he repaired the outer shell, replacing split boards and driving new nails where old ones had loosened. He sealed every seam with a mixture of mud, ash, and straw, the same crude plaster settlers used on cabins, but applied thicker here. Then he began constructing an inner wall, not square like the cabins in town, but following the curve of the tower itself. He measured carefully to leave a gap between the outer planks and his new inner room. 10 inches. Wide enough to hold insulation, narrow enough to preserve living space. The first night he slept there. The floor was bare timber, and the air smelled of fresh wood shavings. He lay wrapped in blankets beside the unlit stove, listening. Wind came after midnight. In his old cabin, wind meant rattling shutters, thin whistling cries, and a creeping draft that found his neck no matter how he turned. Here, it sounded different. It circled. It pressed, then slid. The structure groaned only once, a deep timber note, and then steadied. He slept. At dawn he stepped outside and looked downhill. Smoke from the town, as chimneys bent sharply eastward, flattened by the gusts. Frost clung to cabin walls in uneven patches where wind had forced moisture into seams. The tower's walls were clean. He returned inside and lit the stove for the first time. The cast-iron box sat in the center of the floor, pipe rising straight upward through a hole he had cut carefully into the platform above. He fed it small pieces of pine first, testing the draw. The flame caught quickly. Smoke rose clean and vertical through the pipe, unaffected by sideways gusts. He smiled for the first time in months. The inner wall took longer to finish. He bent thin boards gradually to follow the curve, fastening them to ribs he had shaped from scrap lumber. It formed a circular room within the larger circular chamber, without corners. He left a narrow hatch near the top so warm air could drift upward into the tank space before cooling and settling back down. Neighbors climbed the hill occasionally, partly out of concern, mostly out of curiosity. "You know wood, scarce enough without wasting it on double walls," the blacksmith said, arms folded. Elias handed him a handful of sawdust. "Air's what keeps you warm," he replied, "not wood." The blacksmith shook his head. "Air's what freezes you, only if it moves." When the gap between walls was complete, Elias filled it carefully. Sawdust first, packed but not crushed. Then straw, layered to trap pockets. He tamped it down gently, mindful not to eliminate the very thing he was trying to capture, stillness. Still air holds heat. He had learned that working near freight yards years before, watching how grain stored in bins stayed warmer in the center than near the edges. He had felt how round silos resisted storms better than square sheds. Everything he built now followed that quiet education. By late October, frost hardened into ice each morning. The prairie grass no longer bent softly, it snapped under boots. Elias cut and stacked firewood beside the tower, though his pile was smaller than most. People noticed. "You'll run out by Christmas. Someone warned. Maybe," he answered. Inside, the circular room began to feel less like an experiment and more like a home. He laid planks across the floor, leaving a small crawl space beneath to prevent cold from radiating upward. He hung a lantern from a central beam. He placed his bedroll along the inner wall, where heat would circulate evenly rather than collect in corners. At night he read by lamplight, the wind's voice reduced to a low surrounding murmur. Sometimes he climbed halfway up the ladder to the tank platform and sat listening to how sound changed at different heights. The tower was like an instrument, each gust producing a different tone. He learned its language. One afternoon, a particularly sharp gust struck as he stood outside splitting kindling. Instead of feeling it hit him square as it would between cabin rows, he noticed it deflect around the tower and meet again on the opposite side. Snow that had begun to fall swirled in a spiral, then lifted. The structure was not fighting the wind, it was guiding it. By November, the first true snow arrived. It coated cabin roofs unevenly, piling heavily against north walls. Men with shovels cursed as drifts buried doors. Elias watched from the hill as snow wrapped the lower supports of the tower but did not press hard against its sides. When he stepped inside and closed the door, the difference was immediate. The insulation muffled the outside world. The stove, once lit, warmed the circular room steadily. Heat moved upward, brushed the inner curve, and drifted back down rather than escaping through corners. He placed a small thermometer on a nail near his bed. It was an old instrument, slightly cracked, but accurate enough. Outside that night, 12 degrees F. Inside after 2 hours of fire, 28 degrees F. He fed the stove modestly and watched the needle hold. The following morning, 2 men climbed the hill again, this time without jokes. "Mind if we step in?" one asked. Elias opened the door. Warmth rolled outward in a gentle wave. Not hot, not stifling, just steady. They stood in silence, turning slowly to take in the curved wall, the absence of drafts, the quiet. One of them reached out and pressed his palm against the inner planks. "Fees, even," he muttered. "No corners," Elias said simply. They left without mocking him. That night, alone again, he sat by the stove and thought about the cabin he had lost, about the frost that had crept across its inside walls like a silent tide. He imagined how different that winter might have been if the walls had not invited the wind inside, if the floor had not lain flat against frozen earth. Grief still lived in him, but it no longer filled every space. The tower did. The wind rose again after midnight, stronger than before, rattling loose boards in town. Elias lay awake listening, not with dread but with study. The structure flexed slightly, beams adjusting with a deep, steady groan. The sound was not weakness. It was adaptation. He rose, pulled on his coat, and stepped outside. Moonlight washed the prairie silver. Snow raced low across the ground, driven by gusts that cut like blades. He turned slowly, watching how the tower divided the current. The wind met its curved wall and separated, flowing around both sides before rejoining beyond. He placed his palm against the outer planks. They vibrated gently but did not shudder. For the first time since burying his wife in frozen ground, Elias felt something close to certainty. Not happiness, not yet, but direction. Below, a dog barked, and a door slammed against a cabin frame. Smoke struggled sideways from chimneys. Somewhere a baby cried. Up on the hill, the tower stood steady. Elias went back inside and closed the door against the circling wind. He added one more small log to the stove, adjusted the damper, and sat watching the flames settle into a steady, patient burn. The town might call him foolish, they might call him broken. But as the wind continued its long winter test, rapping and slipping and searching for weakness, Elias Rowan sat inside a forgotten water tower that had outlived 14 storms and would outlive many more. And for the first time he did not feel exposed to the prairie. He felt sheltered by it. By November the prairie had hardened into iron. The soft gold of autumn vanished almost overnight, replaced by a pale crust that cracked under boots and refused to bend. The sky seemed lower now, a hard white dome that pressed down on the Dakota Territory with quiet threat. Smoke from cabin chimneys no longer drifted lazily upward. It bent sharply and tore sideways, flattened by wind that came in long, disciplined waves from the north. The town below the hill had finished building weeks earlier. Cabins stood in tidy rows, rectangular, efficient. Each one framed the same way, 4 sharp corners, vertical plank walls, short eaves, and doors that faced south if the builder had sense. They looked sturdy from a distance. Up close, the wind disagreed. When the first sustained November gale arrived, it did not howl in dramatic bursts. It came steady and relentless, a pressure rather than a scream, 30 miles per hour, perhaps more at the height of the hill. It pressed against flat walls, as if testing them for truth. Elias Rowan stood outside his tower, with his coat collar turned high, watching. The wind struck the north-facing walls of the nearest cabins first. It hit square, flattened against them, and split abruptly at the corners. At each edge, turbulence formed eddies that curled inward and clawed at seams. Snow and powdered frost collected at those corners in thick ridges, driven by the low spiral currents that the eye could not easily see. He had felt those currents inside his old cabin, not as visible spirals, but as thin, icy fingers creeping along floorboards and slipping through joints, no matter how tightly he had hammered them shut. Corners created pressure. Pressure found weakness. He climbed the ladder halfway up the tower and leaned outward carefully, studying how the wind behaved against his new home. It did not slam and split. It curved. The circular wall did not offer resistance in the same language a flat plank did. The air met the rounded surface and was guided aside, forced to change direction gradually rather than abruptly. Instead of forming violent whirlpools at edges, it wrapped and slipped away. The sound was different too. Down in town, gusts produced sharp rattles and sudden thuds as shutters slapped and loose boards flexed. Around the tower, the sound was continuous, a deep, steady rush like water flowing around stone. He descended and stepped inside. The door shut with a solid, sealed thump. Immediately the sound changed from roar to murmur. The inner circular wall stood complete now, forming a smooth ring of fresh boards 10 inches away from the outer shell. Between those layers lay the insulation he had packed so carefully, sawdust and straw layered to trap pockets of still air. He ran his hand along the inner planks. No vibration. No faint whistle at seams. He lit the stove. The cast iron belly warmed slowly at first, then began to glow faintly at its edges. Flames caught and steadied. The stovepipe rose straight up through the central opening he had cut in the platform above, then continued through the tank chamber and out into the sky. He had chosen the center deliberately. In the cabins below, chimneys rose near walls, sometimes too close to corners. When wind struck those walls, it created negative pressure zones that tugged at smoke, pulling it sideways and disrupting the draw. Elias had seen smoke forced back down into rooms on particularly harsh days. Here, in the exact center of a circle, the pipe rose like the mast of a ship in open sea. Outside, the wind whipped harder. Inside, the flame held steady. By evening, the temperature dropped to 9 degrees. The wind did not relent. It pressed and pressed, as if determined to prove a point. Elias sat at his small table and watched the thermometer he had nailed near eye level. 47 degrees. He fed the stove sparingly. The heat did not rush to one side or gather in trapped pockets near corners because there were no corners to gather in. The curved wall encouraged circulation. Warm air rose along the inner surface, drifted upward toward the opening that allowed it to enter the tank chamber above, cooled slightly, and then settled back down in a slow, gentle cycle. Convection without chaos. That night he barely needed an extra blanket. Down the hill, the town fought differently. The blacksmith, who had once called Elias foolish, awoke twice to re-stoke his fire. Each time he opened his stove door, wind tugged at the chimney and sent a brief puff of smoke back into the room. His wife stuffed cloth into the window seams again, though she had sealed them just days before. Frost formed along the inside edge of the north wall, creeping outward from nail heads where cold conducted through iron. Flat walls invited confrontation. The next morning, Elias walked into town for supplies. His woodpile remained modest less than half what many others had stacked. He carried himself quietly, but eyes followed him. "When did he knock your perch down?" Someone called. "No," Elias replied. "Must be drafty up there." He paused, considering the question. "Less than you'd think." Laughter rippled, though not as confident as before. At the general store, conversation circled the same complaint. The wind had found new gaps overnight. One man swore he could feel it rising from the floor itself. Another described how snow had drifted high against the north side of his cabin, pressing moisture into the wood. Elias listened, but did not lecture. He purchased another sack of sawdust. When he returned to the tower, he climbed inside the outer gap through a small panel he had left unfinished and added another layer in sections where settling had occurred. Insulation was not about compression. It was about capturing stillness. He fluffed the straw gently before sealing the panel again. By mid-November, temperatures fell further. 3 degrees one night, then -2. The wind maintained its steady campaign. Elias conducted quiet experiments. He placed a small candle near the inner wall and watched its flame. It did not flicker toward any hidden drift. He held a thin strip of cloth at various points along the floor. It hung limp. He climbed halfway up toward the tank chamber and felt the subtle temperature change, warmer air lingering above before slowly descending again. The tank space served a purpose he had only suspected at first. Cold air is heavier than warm air. In most cabins, when heat rises to the ceiling, it presses directly against a thin roof and escapes or condenses, leaving the lower space cold. In the tower, the inner room ended well below the iron tank. The space above acted as a buffer chamber where excess warmth could rise without immediately escaping, and where incoming cold air, should it seep through the upper boards, remained suspended above the living area before mixing slowly. It was not perfect insulation. It was layered defense. Another storm arrived before Thanksgiving. This one carried fine snow like powdered glass. It stung the face and filled every exposed crease in clothing. Elias stood outside again to observe. The snow struck the tower and split, flowing around the curved sides. Very little adhered directly to the vertical surface. Instead, it drifted lower near the base supports where wind speed dropped naturally. In town, snow packed heavily against cabin corners. Where two flat walls met, drifts grew thick and stubborn. Men shoveled repeatedly, but each gust rebuilt what they cleared. That evening, a knock came at the tower door. It was the blacksmith. He stepped inside hesitantly, removing his hat. The warmth surprised him into silence. "Fees," he began, then stopped. "Even?" Elias supplied gently. The blacksmith nodded. He walked slowly along the inner curve, pressing his palm against the wood in different places, as if searching for hidden drafts. "You say you left space between walls?" "Yes." "Filled with what?" "Sawdust and straw." The blacksmith frowned. "Would solid logs be better?" "Solid wood carries cold through it," Elias said. "Air, when it does move, resists it." The blacksmith glanced toward the ceiling. "And the height?" "Heat rises," Elias replied. "Let it rise without losing it." They stood quietly for a moment, listening to the wind circle outside. "It does rattle," the blacksmith muttered. "No corners to catch it." The man exhaled slowly, absorbing more than he admitted aloud. "Wood pile of yours looks small." "It's enough." When he left, he did not laugh. The cold intensified in December. -10, then -15. The prairie seemed carved from glass. Inside most cabins, families gathered close to their stoves. Corners remained chilly no matter how hot the fire burned. People rotated seating positions through the day to avoid the creeping cold that pooled along walls. In Elias, a circular room, temperature differences were subtle. There was no far corner for cold to hide in. Air moved in slow loops, rather than stagnating in pockets. He used half the wood he had used the previous winter. Not because the stove burned hotter, because the structure refused to surrender heat so easily. He measured the difference carefully one particularly brutal evening. Outside, -5 degrees. Inside, after steady burning but not excessive feeding, 45 degrees. 25 degrees of separation from the prairie. He did not boast about the number, but word traveled. A young farmer climbed the hill one afternoon with a question disguised as casual curiosity. He examined the door seal, the thickness of the inner wall, the way the stovepipe ran straight upward. "You ever get smoke pushed back down?" he asked. "Not yet." "Even in crosswind?" "The wind raps," Elias said. "It does T-strike." The farmer nodded slowly, eyes tracing the curve. "What about storms?" "We'll see," Elias answered. The shape that fought the wind was not truly fighting at all. It was cooperating. That was the difference Elias understood now. Flat walls declared defiance. "Stop here." The wind responded with force. Curved walls redirected, "Pass around." The wind complied. On the longest night of the year, when darkness arrived early and refused to leave, Elias climbed into the tank chamber with a lantern. Frost had formed lightly along the iron interior, but the space was not as bitter as the open air outside. Warm currents from below tempered it slightly. He sat there for a time, lantern dimmed, listening to the wind sweep over the roof. He thought about how men often built to resist without considering how nature moved. Square cabins were easier to frame, easier to measure, but ease did not guarantee wisdom. The tower had been designed for water, not for living. Yet its form held lessons cabins had ignored. When he descended back into the inner room, the stove glowed steadily. The thermometer read 42 degrees. Outside, it was -12. He removed his coat and sat near the curved wall, feeling no cold seep through. The shape was doing its quiet work. By late December, fewer jokes traveled up the hill. More questions did. One evening, as wind circled the tower in a long, unbroken sweep, Elias stood in the center of his room and turned slowly in place. The air felt consistent at every point in the circle. No cold edge, no hidden draft. He understood then that geometry was not abstract mathematics. It was survival. The prairie would continue to test every structure built upon it. It would search for angles, weaknesses, seams. The water tower offered fewer invitations. And inside its curved embrace, with sawdust-packed walls and a chimney rising clean through the center, Elias Rowan felt something stronger than warmth. He felt alignment with wind, with air, with the quiet logic of shape. Outside, the gales pressed on, relentless and disciplined. Inside, the flame did not flicker. January arrived without ceremony, only a deeper kind of silence. The prairie did not roar when the cold settled in. It hardened. Sound itself seemed to shrink. Snow no longer fell in soft flakes, but moved as dry crystals that skittered across the frozen ground like ground glass. Breath turned instantly to vapor and hung in the air longer than it should, as if reluctant to drift away. On the third morning of the month, the thermometer outside the general store read 20 below zero. Men gathered around it not because they doubted the number, but because seeing it together made it feel survivable. Wind came later. By noon it was steady at 30 miles an hour, by dusk stronger. It did not gust in wild surges. It pushed continuously, like a heavy hand against every wall in town. Smoke from chimneys did not rise at all now. It was forced sideways the instant it left the flue, torn into ragged streaks that vanished across the white horizon. Inside the cabins below the hill, fires burned hard and fast. Stove doors opened and closed in constant rhythm. Wood piles shrank visibly. Frost crept along interior boards, no matter how fiercely the flames were fed. Where iron nails pierced outer planks, cold conducted inward, blooming tiny white halos around each head. Water buckets placed near walls froze at their edges. Windows filmed over with ice so thick that light dimmed to a gray blur. Up on the hill, Elias Rowan woke before dawn. He lay still beneath his blankets, listening. The wind had been pressing since some time in the night. He could hear it circling the tower in a continuous, low rush, like distant surf. The structure answered in deep, slow creaks timber, shifting slightly under sustained load, but not snapping, not rattling. He swung his legs from the bed and set his boots on the wooden floor. The boards were cool, but not biting. He crossed to the thermometer nailed beside the inner wall and leaned close in the lantern light. 43 degrees. He glanced toward the small frosted pane he had installed in the door. Beyond it, the sky was still black-blue. He opened the door briefly and felt the outside air slash inward. The cold was a living thing. He shut the door quickly and sealed it again. The thermometer outside, mounted in a protected niche near the entrance, read -5. He stood still for a moment, letting the comparison settle in his mind. A difference of 48 degrees between interior air and the open prairie beyond the door. Even accounting for the brief heat loss when he opened it, the interior had held steady through the night, with only 2 modest additions of wood, before sleep. He fed the stove carefully, not in panic, not in excess. The flame caught and steadied, drawing cleanly upward through the centered pipe. No backdraft, no sputter. Even with one pressing hard around the exterior, the vertical rise of the chimney and its position in the calm center of the circular flow kept the draw true. He had predicted this, but prediction and proof were different things. By mid-morning, word had traveled through town that the cold would intensify overnight. Some spoke of 30 below in outlying areas. Livestock were being moved closer to barns. Extra blankets were unrolled. A farmer named Harlan, whose cabin sat near the edge of town and bore the brunt of northern winds, decided to climb the hill. He did not announce his purpose. He told his wife he was checking fence lines. The climb was harder than usual. The wind hit him square in the chest, pushing his breath back into his throat. Snow scraped across his coat in relentless waves. When he reached the tower, he paused, steadying himself against one of the thick timber supports. He knocked. The door opened almost immediately, as if Elias had been expecting him. Warm air flowed outward, not hot, not stifling, but unmistakably warmer than the air Harlan had been fighting through. "Morning?" Elias said simply. Harlan stepped inside without ceremony. The door shut. The roar dulled to a muted surround. He removed his gloves slowly, flexing fingers that had begun to stiffen in the climb. He looked around the circular room, eyes tracing the curve of the inner wall, the steady glow of the stove, the absence of visible frost. "What is your reading?" he asked. Elias pointed to the thermometer. 45 degrees. Harlan frowned slightly, doing the math in his head. "Down in town it is 15 below." Elias nodded. "That is 30 degrees. Closer to 25 through most of the night." Elias replied. It dipped lower before dawn. Harlan crossed to the wall and placed his palm against it. He left it there for several seconds, as if expecting a hidden draft to reveal itself. Nothing did. "In my place," Harlan said quietly, "the north corner, as near as cold as outside. We sit close to the stove and still feel it on our backs." Elias did not gloat. "Corners catch pressure," he said. "Pressure drives cold through seams." Harlan looked upward. "And the tank above?" "Buffer," Elias replied. "Heat rises into it, but doesn't leave all at once. Cold that sneaks in stays high until it mixes slow." Harlan nodded, absorbing the explanation more deeply than he admitted. He stayed for nearly an hour, partly to warm himself, partly to understand. When he stepped back outside, the wind hit him hard enough to make him stagger. He glanced back at the tower and noticed something he had not paid attention to before. Snow did not cling thickly to its sides. It streamed around, settling lower near the base supports, where airflow slowed naturally. He descended the hill in silence. That night the true test came. By sunset the temperature had fallen to -20. By midnight, lower still. The wind strengthened to a sustained 40 miles per hour, producing a wind chill so severe exposed skin burned within seconds. In town, stove fires roared continuously. Men woke every 2 hours to feed them. Chimneys moaned under crosswinds, sometimes coughing smoke back into rooms. Frost thickened along walls despite constant heat. At Harlan's cabin, a bucket of water set 3 feet from the stove formed a thin crust of ice before dawn. Up on the hill, Elias adjusted his damper slightly and added 2 split logs to the stove before lying down. He did not wake until morning. When he rose, frost traced delicate patterns along the lower portion of the outer door frame, minor infiltration at the threshold, but the inner circular wall remained dry. The thermometer read 42 degrees. He opened the door carefully and checked the exterior reading. -3 outside at that moment, though it had been far lower overnight. He returned inside and stood still in the center of the room, listening. The wind still pressed, but the structure did not shudder. The curved wall distributed force evenly. No single seam bore the brunt of impact. He thought about his old cabin again, how wind had hit one wall hard and forced its way inward at corners, how the flat roof had created eddies that drove snow against the eaves. He remembered waking to relight a stove that had struggled under shifting pressure. Here, the flame had remained steady. Mid-morning brought another visitor. The blacksmith returned, this time without sarcasm in his posture. "Town saying you're 30 degrees warmer," he said bluntly. 25 to 30 depending," Elias replied. The blacksmith exhaled through his beard. "My boy as room as near frozen on the north side." We moved his bed closer to the stove. He walked the perimeter of the inner wall again. Slower this time, noticing details he overlooked before. The tight joinery of the boards, the way the insulation hatch had been sealed flush, the centered placement of the stove. "How much wood you burn last night?" Elias gestured toward the small stack near the door. 2 armfuls. The blacksmith stared. I burned near 5. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Show me, the blacksmith said finally. Elias retrieved a scrap of charcoal and knelt on the floor, sketching a simple diagram on a spare plank, a circle, a second circle within it. Arrows indicating airflow wrapping around the exterior. Arrows showing heat rising gently and descending again. When does T stop? Elias said. You can T command it to, but you can stop giving it edges to grab. The blacksmith crouched, studying the drawing. And the gap between walls? Still air slows transfer, Elias said. Wood alone carries cold straight through. Air trapped dawn T. The blacksmith nodded slowly. Might be too late this winter to change much. Maybe, Elias said, but next winter will come too. The cold held for another week. Each day confirmed the pattern. The difference inside the tower hovered between 25 and 30 degrees warmer than the open air, even under sustained wind. Wood consumption remained modest. The stovepipe never backdrafted. Children began climbing halfway up the hill not to mock, but to see the strange home that defied the prairie. One afternoon, Elias invited 3 of them inside briefly to warm their hands. They spun slowly in the circular room, marveling at how their voices sounded different, less echo, more even. Feels like being inside a barrel, one said. Elias smiled faintly. Barrels keep things safe. By late January, the story had shifted tone. It was no longer about madness. It was about mathematics, though few used that word. Harlan returned one evening carrying his own thermometer. He wanted to compare readings precisely. They stepped outside together, bracing against wind, and confirmed the numbers. -8 outside at that hour. 46 inside. 34 degrees of difference at that moment. Harlan shook his head in disbelief. Ne'er thought shape mattered that much, he admitted. Everything is shape, Elias said quietly. Wind a shape. Heat a shape. That night, as another long freeze set in, Elias climbed into the tank chamber once more. He brought the lantern and sat cross-legged beneath the iron curve. Frost had formed along parts of the metal interior, but the air was not as savage as outside. Warmth from below had tempered it again. He imagined the layers working together, outer wall deflecting force, insulated gap resisting transfer, inner wall guiding circulation, upper chamber buffering extremes. It was not luxury. It was logic. He descended and closed the hatch carefully. In the circular room below, the fire burned with a calm, steady glow. The thermometer read 44. Outside, the prairie lay locked in white silence under a sky that glittered with cold stars. Inside the tower, Elias Rowan removed his coat and sat comfortably near the center of the room. He did not need to huddle close to the stove. He did not need to rotate positions to escape cold corners. He did not need to fear that the next gust would force smoke back into his lungs. The number 25 degrees warmer had become more than a measurement. It was proof that understanding the wind mattered more than fighting it. And as the coldest nights of January tightened their grip on the Dakota Territory, the abandoned water tower on the hill quietly demonstrated that geometry, patience, and observation could turn ridicule into refuge. February did not arrive gently. It came with a sky the color of hammered tin and a stillness so complete that even the crows had gone quiet. The air that morning felt wrong, too heavy, too expectant. Old-timers in town said the same thing in different words. Storm building north, someone muttered outside the general store. By noon, the horizon disappeared. It did not fade gradually. It vanished behind a wall of white that advanced across the prairie like a living thing. Snow lifted from the ground before fresh flakes even began to fall, pulled upward into a low swirling curtain. The temperature hovered near 0, but the wind carried a promise that it would not stay there. Elias Rowan stood at the base of the tower and watched it come. He had seen blizzards before sharp squalls that dumped snow and passed within hours. This was different. The air pressure shifted. His ears popped slightly. The wind did not gust, it gathered itself. He stepped inside and barred the door. The first impact sounded like sand thrown against wood. Then it became steady, rising quickly from a hiss to a roar. The tower absorbed it in one long exhale. The curved outer wall did what it had done all winter it redirected. But this time the force was sustained and violent. Snow struck sideways. Within minutes, daylight dimmed to a gray haze filtering through the small pane in the door. Elias moved calmly through his preparations. He checked the door seal, pressing along its edges to ensure no gaps had formed. He adjusted the insulation hatch panel and tightened its latch. He added a measured amount of wood to the stove, not too much, not too little. Overheating during a blizzard wasted fuel. Steady heat mattered more. The stovepipe drew clean and vertical despite the wind screaming beyond the walls. By late afternoon, the tower vibrated under sustained 40-mile-per-hour winds, with higher bursts slamming against its sides. The sound was no longer a low surrounding rush. It was a deep, continuous thunder, like distant surf magnified and wrapped around him. He climbed halfway up the ladder inside and listened carefully to the tank chamber above. The iron cylinder groaned occasionally as temperature differences tightened and relaxed its metal skin. The sound was not alarming. It was structural conversation materials adjusting under stress. He descended and placed his hand flat against the inner circular wall. No draft, no tremor that translated inward. Outside, the storm intensified. Snow began falling heavily now, not drifting but driving, propelled nearly horizontal by the wind. Visibility in town dropped to yards. Men who had stepped outside to secure shutters scrambled back indoors. Doors slammed. Animals cried out in barns. The first report of collapse came just after dusk. A shed near the north edge of town lost part of its roof. Snow had packed unevenly along one side where wind eddied against a corner. The weight became too much. Timber snapped. Inside the tower, Elias heard none of this directly. He heard only wind and the steady breathing of the stove. He stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, evaluating sound. In a square cabin, wind changes tone depending on which wall bears the brunt. Here, it was uniform. The circular shape distributed pressure around the full circumference, preventing any single seam from taking full force. He added a log. The thermometer read 46 degrees. Outside, the temperature dropped further as night deepened. The wind chill pushed conditions into a realm where exposed flesh froze in minutes. Snow did not settle gently on roofs, it slammed against them, building thick ridges along north-facing edges. In town, cabin corners became collection points. Snow piled high where two walls met, compressing under its own weight and pushing moisture against plank seams. Men took turns opening doors briefly to shovel, but the effort was futile. Drifts rebuilt faster than they cleared. At Harlan's cabin, the north wall groaned under accumulating pressure. The short eaves offered little protection. Snow plastered against vertical boards, filling microscopic gaps, and then freezing solid, expanding as it did. His wife whispered a prayer as another gust shook the frame. Up on the hill, snow did not cling the same way. The tower's curved sides refused to offer a flat landing. Wind that struck it split and accelerated around the curve, carrying much of the snow onward. Accumulation occurred lower near the base supports where airflow naturally slowed, but the main body remained relatively clear. Elias opened the inner hatch briefly and climbed into the tank chamber with his lantern. The upper space hummed like a drum. Wind raced over the exterior roof in continuous sheets, yet the iron tank above him, though cold, was not battered evenly. Its cylindrical form, like the walls below, shed force smoothly. He imagined the blizzard as water flowing around a stone in a river. The stone did not fight the current. It divided it. He descended again and closed the hatch carefully. Hours passed. The storm did not ease. At midnight, a violent gust struck with enough force to make the entire structure shudder once. Elias braced instinctively, hand on the central support beam. The tower answered with a deep, resonant groan, but it did not crack. The force traveled around the circumference and dissipated instead of concentrating at a corner joint. He waited. The wind continued, but the initial shock passed. He moved to the door and pressed his shoulder lightly against it, feeling the pressure from outside. It was immense, but evenly distributed. No single hinge bore all the strain. In town, the blacksmith's chimney struggled. A crosswind caught the short stack and forced smoke downward in bursts. He adjusted the damper repeatedly, but gusts were unpredictable between cabin rows where wind ricocheted off flat walls and formed chaotic currents. The geometry of the town amplified turbulence. Up on the hill, the tower stood alone. Nothing obstructed the wind before it met the curved surface. The flow remained cleaner, more predictable. By 2 in the morning, drifts in town reached halfway up some cabin doors. Snow-filled alleys between buildings in uneven mounds. Roofs collected heavy layers on their leeward sides where airflow slowed and allowed accumulation. One cabin near the edge of town suffered a partial roof collapse. The flat plane had allowed snow to settle thick and unbalanced. The supporting beams snapped under weight. Cries pierced the storm briefly before being swallowed by wind. Inside the tower, Elias heard only the relentless roar. He fed the stove sparingly again. His woodpile, though smaller than others, was sufficient. The insulation and airflow efficiency meant he did not need to burn furiously to maintain comfort. He checked the thermometer. 43 degrees. Stable. He slept in intervals, waking occasionally not from cold but from curiosity, listening to how the storm spoke against the curved wall. Toward dawn, the wind began to shift slightly, veering northwest. Snowfall remained heavy, but the initial violent gusts softened into sustained pressure rather than explosive bursts. When gray light finally filtered through the small door pane, Elias rose carefully. He waited before opening the door, allowing drifting snow outside to settle slightly. Then he unbarred it and pushed. Resistance met him not from snow plastered against the door itself, but from a drift formed lower, near the base supports. He leaned his shoulder into it and cleared a narrow path. The world outside was transformed. The prairie had disappeared beneath sculpted waves of white. Drifts rose in curved shapes where wind had carved them. In town, cabin roofs bore uneven loads, snow stacked high against north walls, nearly reaching window sills in some cases. He stepped fully outside and circled the tower cautiously. One side remained relatively clear, wind having swept accumulation away. The opposite side bore a gentle slope of drift rising against the supports, but not pressing heavily against the vertical wall itself. The curved form had prevented thick, flat layers from clinging to the main body. He did not need to shovel immediately. Below, townsfolk were already digging. Men emerged from doors half buried in snow. Shovels flashed in the pale light. Voices carried thinly in the cold air. The shed that had lost its roof lay twisted and broken. Harlan spotted Elias on the hill and paused. The tower stood intact, not a plank torn loose, not a seam blown open. By mid-morning, several men began to climb upward, curiosity outweighing exhaustion. They reached the base breathless and stared upward at the structure that had faced the same storm and remained unmoved. Elias opened the door before they knocked. Warm air greeted them again. "How much snow you get against the walls?" One asked immediately. "Less than you," Elias replied. They stepped inside and removed hats, stunned not only by warmth but by the absence of damage. "You hear about Jensen's shed?" Another asked. Elias nodded slowly. "Flat roof, uneven load." The blacksmith ran his hand along the inner curve again, as he had done weeks earlier. This time there was no skepticism in his touch. "Snow could grab hold," he muttered. "No edges to stack against," Elias said. They climbed halfway up the ladder to inspect the tank chamber. Even there, no sign of structural strain beyond minor frost along metal seams. "It rotted out," Harlan said quietly. Elias corrected him gently. "It let it pass." That distinction settled heavily in the room. Outside, townsfolk worked tirelessly to free doors and reinforce weakened roofs. The storm had not destroyed the settlement, but it had exposed weaknesses. Corners had become collection points. Flat plains had invited burden. By afternoon, the wind eased further. Sunlight broke through in thin, cold beams that made the snow glare painfully bright. From the hill, Elias could see the pattern clearly, drifts piled high against square cannons, forming sharp angles where two walls met. Between buildings, chaotic wind channels had created unpredictable mounds and bare patches. Around the tower, snow lay sculpted in smooth arcs. The structure had not fought the blizzard. It had shaped it. As evening approached and temperatures dropped again under clear skies, Elias returned inside and added wood to the stove. He felt no triumph, only confirmation. The blizzard had been the final examination. Wind at full strength. Snow driven horizontal. Sustained pressure through the night. The circular walls had distributed force evenly. The insulation gap had prevented heat loss despite extreme cold. The elevated base had kept the floor above drifting snow and frozen ground. The central chimney had maintained steady draw. He sat at his table and listened to the quieter wind outside, now reduced to a manageable whisper compared to the previous night's fury. In town, stories were already changing. They no longer spoke of a madman living in a relic. They spoke of a structure that had stood clean where others sagged. When darkness settled once more over the prairie, the tower on the hill cast a long, thin shadow across the snow under starlight. Inside, Elias Rowan rested in steady warmth, while the aftermath of the storm glittered beyond his door. The blizzard had come to test every structure equally, and the one with no corners had given it nothing to break. Spring did not erase the winter, it revealed what it had changed. When the thaw finally began, it came first as sound. Drips from eaves, the soft collapse of snowbanks shrinking into themselves, the slow trickle of meltwater cutting narrow channels through packed drifts. The prairie did not turn green overnight. It bled white into brown and brown into mud. From the hill, Elias Rowan watched the transformation with the same quiet attention he had given the wind. The tower stood exactly as it had in January, upright, unwarped, its curved planks tight and true. The drift that had leaned gently against its base during the blizzard had melted evenly, leaving the supports dry and unstrained. No seam had opened. No board had split. Down in town, repairs were underway. Jensen rebuilt his shed with heavier beams. Harlan replaced 2 warp planks along his north wall. The blacksmith extended his chimney higher after repeated winter backdrafts had filled his shop with smoke. But something else had changed too. Men no longer laughed when they climbed the hill. The first request came in early April. Harlan arrived carrying a coil of rope and a bundle of rough sketches folded inside his coat. He did not pretend the visit was casual. "I've been thinking," he said, stepping inside the circular room where a small spring fire burned low. "About next winter." Elias nodded. "My north wall every year takes the worst of it. Corners packed with snow, frost creeps along the seam. I can rebuild the whole cabin, but maybe," he hesitated, "maybe I can change part of it." Elias pulled out a small wooden crate and turned it upside down to serve as a seat. "Show me." Harlan unfolded his papers. The sketches were rough, lines uncertain. He had drawn his rectangular cabin, and, beside it, a strange rounded addition attached to the north side like a barrel laid on its side. "I was thinking," Harlan said slowly, "if the wind hits something curved first, maybe it won't slam the flat wall as hard." Elias studied the drawing. "A windbreak chamber," he said quietly. Harlan looked up. "Is that what you call it?" "It'll change the flow," Elias replied. "Might help." They went outside together. Elias walked around Harlan's cabin, observing its orientation, the way the north wind struck it across open ground with no obstruction. "You don't need to rebuild everything," Elias said, "but you can start giving it sharp edges." Over the next weeks, word spread. The blacksmith arrived with questions about chimney placement. He had extended his flue higher, but still fought crosswinds between cabin rows. Elias suggested moving the stove slightly inward and rerouting the pipe more centrally through the roof, even if it meant patching the old hole. "Center is calmest," Elias explained. "Wind wraps around a circle. Inside that wrap, pressure is steadier." The blacksmith frowned thoughtfully. "Hard to make a square building behave like a circle." "Not fully," Elias agreed. "But you can reduce what it fights." Others came too. A farmer whose roof had sagged under uneven snow loads asked about pitch and overhang. Elias described how snow accumulated where airflow slowed, especially near leeward edges. Extending eaves on the north side, or altering roof angles slightly, could encourage sliding rather than piling. "You watch how snow moves," Elias said. "It tells you where weight gathers." The conversations were not lectures, they were exchanges. Elias never claimed mastery. He described what he had observed, what had worked inside the tower. Others adapted those lessons to square structures. By May, the town looked subtly different. Harlan had built a curved windbreak on the north side of his cabin, an arched structure made from bent saplings and plank segments, filled with straw between inner and outer layers. It was not elegant, but it changed the way wind met his home. The blacksmith repositioned his stove closer to the center of his shop and extended his chimney straight up through a newly cut opening, patching the old wall vent. Jensen rebuilt his shed with a sloped roof and slightly rounded corner supports, softening the angles where drifts had once formed thick and destructive. Children began referring to the hill not as the Fool, as Perch, but as Ruinous Tower. Elias did not encourage the name. He continued refining his own structure quietly. With warmer weather, he inspected the outer planks carefully. He replaced two boards that had begun to soften near nail holes and sealed them again with mud and ash mixture. He adjusted the insulation gap where settling had occurred over winter, fluffing sawdust to maintain trapped air pockets. He also made one small improvement he had been considering since January. Using scrap lumber and careful measurement, he constructed a low circular bench along the inner wall, leaving a narrow gap between it and the planks to maintain airflow. The bench served both as seating and as subtle insulation, reducing direct contact with the inner wall surface while allowing warm air to circulate behind it. When summer approached and winds softened into warm breezes, Elias sometimes sat outside the tower and watched how grass moved in waves across the prairie. Even in gentler seasons, patterns remained visible. Everything moved in curves. There were no straight lines in wind. By late summer, travelers passing through Dakota Territory began to notice something unusual. Beyond the standard rectangular cabins, a few new structures bore softened shapes. A grain storage shed built slightly rounded at its corners. A smokehouse constructed cylindrical rather than square. A barn whose north wall sloped gently instead of standing vertical. The changes were subtle at first, but they multiplied. One afternoon, a wagon carrying a family bound farther west stopped in town. The father climbed the hill after hearing murmurs of a man who lived inside a water tower and had stayed warmer than anyone during the worst storm in years. He knocked respectfully. Elias opened the door. The traveler stepped inside, eyes widening at the circular room. "You built this for winter?" he asked. "I built it to understand winter," Elias replied. The traveler nodded slowly. He asked about insulation, about chimney draw, about the elevated base. Elias answered plainly, showing him the 10-inch gap between walls, explaining how still air resisted cold better than solid timber alone. Before leaving, the traveler turned back at the door. People left, he asked. At first. And now? Elias looked down the hill at the evolving town. Now they build differently. That autumn, as another winter approached, the differences became clearer. Harlan's curved windbreak caught the first northern gusts and guided them around his cabin rather than slamming into the flat wall. Snow drifted differently along its sides. Inside, he reported fewer drafts and a more stable temperature. The blacksmith's central chimney drew more reliably, even under shifting crosswinds. Jensen's shed roof shed snow more evenly during early storms, preventing the uneven load that had once crushed it. No structure in town became perfectly circular. Lumber and habit made that unlikely, but corners were softened. Air gaps were added. Roof lines adjusted. The phrase began circulating quietly among settlers, "Let the wind pass." It was not attributed to Elias openly, but its origin was known. By November, the prairie hardened again. The first cold snap tested the modifications. Wind struck as always. Harlan stood inside his cabin and waited for the familiar creeping chill along the north wall. It did not arrive as sharply. The curved windbreak outside diverted the brunt. Snow gathered lower along its base, not directly against the main wall. The interior temperature held more steadily. He still burned wood, but less furiously. He climbed the hill later that week with a quiet grin. "Works," he said simply. Elias nodded. "I don't stay 30 degrees warmer like you," Harlan admitted, "but I'm not fighting it as hard." "That's enough," Elias replied. The second winter did not bring a blizzard as fierce as the previous February, but it brought its share of bitter nights. And for the first time, fewer families complained of frozen buckets 3 feet from the stove, fewer chimneys coughed smoke backward, fewer roof beams groaned under uneven drifts. The tower remained the most extreme example of curved design, but it was no longer an isolated curiosity. It had become a reference point. Travelers passing through began asking about the roundhouse on the hill. Some stayed a night in town and left carrying small sketches of insulation gaps and altered roof pitches. One man from a neighboring settlement returned months later with news that he had built a cylindrical grain silo converted into a workshop inspired by what he had seen. "Stays warmer than my old shed ever did," he reported proudly. By the third winter, children growing up in the town accepted softened shapes as ordinary. They no longer questioned why Harlan's north wall bulged gently outward, or why Jensen's shed roof curved slightly at the edges. They had not known the time when everything had sharp corners. One evening, as snow drifted lightly outside, the blacksmith stood inside the tower once more. "Funny thing," he said thoughtfully, staring at the inner wall. "All these years we built straight because it was easier. Never thought to ask if easier was better." Elias stirred the stove gently. "Straight lines are easy to measure," he said. "When does he measure?" The blacksmith chuckled softly. Down the hill, the settlement bore the marks of adaptation. Not revolution, not grand reinvention, just subtle wisdom layered into timber and nail. The tower still stood tallest, its silhouette distinct against winter skies. But it was no longer a symbol of madness. It was a teacher. And Elias Rowan, who had once climbed the hill alone with grief heavier than lumber, now found himself consulted rather than mocked. He had not set out to change how the town built its homes. He had only sought to survive winter without surrendering half his firewood and all his comfort. Yet by studying wind instead of cursing it, by shaping wood to guide rather than resist, he had shifted something larger than a single structure. He had shifted perspective. And when the north wind returned again in steady waves, circling the tower and flowing around softened corners below, it no longer sounded like an enemy. It sounded like a lesson, repeating itself across the prairie, one that the town had finally begun to hear. By the 4th year, no one in Dakota Territory called it foolish anymore. They called it Rowan's Tower. The name settled naturally, the way snow settled into low places gradually, then all at once. Travelers used it as a landmark when giving directions. "Turn east at Rowan's Tower." Children pointed to it when newcomers asked where the hill path led. Even the town clerk, who had once laughed while handing over the deed, referred to it with a certain measured respect. Elias never asked for that. He still rose before dawn, still split wood in quiet rhythm, still checked his door seals when the air shifted in tone before a storm. But his solitude had changed shape. It was no longer isolation. It was chosen distance. That autumn, a surveyor passed through town with official maps rolled in a leather tube. He climbed the hill out of curiosity more than necessity, claiming he wanted a better vantage point to chart the land. Elias invited him inside. The surveyor removed his gloves and turned slowly in the circular room, eyes bright with professional interest. "You are living inside a structure meant for water pressure," he said, "and you've adapted it for air pressure." Elias smiled faintly. "Pressure is pressure." The surveyor laughed softly. "Most men fight the elements. You redirected them." He unrolled his map on the small table and marked the tower, a position more carefully than the surrounding cabins. "Round forms last," he said almost to himself. "That is why old fortifications use them. No corners for force to focus on." When he left, he carried not just coordinates, but the story. By winter that year, neighboring settlements had begun experimenting in small ways. Word traveled slower than wind, but it traveled. A grain farmer 50 miles west built a cylindrical smokehouse after hearing about the tower. A widow south of town insulated her cabin walls with a layered gap of straw and sawdust rather than adding thicker planks alone. A barn roof was pitched differently to encourage snow to slide rather than stack. No one credited Elias formally. They simply repeated what worked. In town, the transformation was subtle but undeniable. Where once every cabin had stood as a sharp-edged box against the prairie, now many bores softened. Corners, extended eaves, central chimneys, or small windbreak chambers built on their north sides. Not perfect circles, lumber was still cut straight. Habits still ran deep, adaptations shaped by observation. One evening, after the first steady freeze of the season, Harlan climbed the hill again. He did not bring sketches this time. He brought a bottle. They sat at the small table inside the tower, the stove glowing steadily between them. "Third winter since the blizzard," Harlan said. "First one I ain't tea dreading." Elias poured a small measure into 2 tin cups. "How is your north wall?" he asked. "Still square," Harlan admitted, "but the windbreak does its job. Wood pile less smaller now. Not half what you used, but better than before." Elias nodded. Harlan leaned back, studying the curved inner wall again. "Funny thing, when folks pass through now, they don't laugh, they ask." "What do they ask?" "How to build smarter." The phrase lingered. Build smarter. Elias had never thought of himself as clever. He had simply been tired of losing heat and wood and comfort to a wine that did not care about pride. But the effect had grown beyond him. Late that winter, a young couple arrived in town with little more than a wagon and 2 mules. They intended to settle permanently, instead of building immediately in the pattern of every old cabin. They climbed the hill first. The young man removed his hat nervously. "We heard you might have advice." Elias listened to their plans. Limited lumber, limited coin, a small patch of land near the creek. "You don't need a tower," he told them. "But don't give the wind corners to punish, and don't trust thick wood alone to keep you warm." He walked them down the hill and stood with them on their chosen plot. He observed the open stretch of prairie to the north, the slight rise to the west, the tree line far beyond. "Angle your cabin slightly," he said. "Not square to the wind. Let it meet the wall at a slant." They nodded, absorbing every word. By the time their home stood complete, it looked different from the old cabin. Slightly angled, a modest curved shed attached to its north side, a central stove and chimney placed thoughtfully rather than conveniently. When winter arrived, they did not struggle as their predecessors once had. The phrase began to circulate beyond the town. Rowan design. Elias disliked the sound of it. He corrected anyone who used it near him. It's not design, he would say. It is watching. But names have a way of sticking. One particularly harsh January night, nothing like the great blizzard, but bitter enough, Elias stood outside the tower under a sky full of stars. Snow lay quiet across the prairie, wind whispering low rather than roaring. He turned, slowly, looking down at the town. Chimney smoke rose straighter now than it once had. Fewer plumes bent sharply sideways. Roof lines caught the starlight differently, some slightly curved or extended. Windbreak additions cast soft shadows against cabin walls. The settlement had evolved. Not because someone had issued orders, not because a law demanded it, because winter had taught them something, and they had chosen to listen. Footsteps crunched behind him. The blacksmith approached, older now, beard more silver than brown. "You see it too?" he asked quietly. "See what?" "The change." Elias nodded. The blacksmith folded his arms against the cold. "Remember when we called you mad?" "I remember." "You weren't tea fighting winter," the blacksmith said. "You were studying it." Elias looked back at the tower's curved wall pale under moonlight. "I was tired of losing," he said. The blacksmith chuckled softly. "Well, you've won more than you meant to." Years passed. The railroad spur that had once justified the water tower, as construction was used less frequently. The iron tank above Elias, as living space, remained empty, a relic of another era. But the structure itself had found a second life. Travelers paused not to mock, but to marvel. Some sketched it in notebooks. Others carried its lessons farther west, where prairie winds blew just as hard and winters cut just as deep. One spring, a letter arrived from a settlement nearly 50 miles away. A man wrote that he had built a cylindrical grain store inspired by the tower north of Dakota, and that it had saved his harvest from freezing solid. Elias folded the letter carefully and placed it inside a small wooden box. He did not seek recognition. He sought alignment. As he aged, climbing the ladder to the tank chamber became slower, but he still did it occasionally, lantern in hand, listening to wind move over the curved roof. The sound never changed. It rapped, it flowed, it passed. On the 10th winter since he had moved into the tower, another strong storm swept across the prairie, not as catastrophic as the great blizzard, but fierce enough to test structures once more. From inside his circular room, Elias listened calmly. The tower answered with deep, steady tones. Below, the town held firm. Roofs shed snow more evenly now. Windbreaks softened pressure. Chimneys drew reliably. No frantic midnight shoveling, no collapsed sheds. Winter still came. But it no longer dominated. Near dawn, as wind eased and the storm, as final gusts faded, Elias sat at his table, hands resting lightly against the warm wood. He thought about the first day he had stood beneath the abandoned tower, mocked and alone. He had not known then that he was stepping into more than shelter. He was stepping into perspective. The prairie had not changed. The wind had not softened. The cold had not grown merciful. But the people had adapted. And adaptation, he understood now, was stronger than defiance. As sunlight filtered pale and gold through the small pane in his door, Elias Rowan rose slowly, added a final split log to the stove, and opened the door to a quiet, reshaped world. The tower stood steady behind him, tall against the winter sky, no longer a symbol of foolishness, but proof that sometimes the strongest home is not the one that stands rigid against the storm. It is the one that learns how to let it pass.